Chapter 6: The Mechanics of Karmic Administration. Karma as lawful feedback rather than moral reward or punishment. The word karma is often reduced to a simple moral equation. Open quote, do good and good things happen. Do bad and bad things happen. Close quote. This interpretation is attractive because it makes the universe resemble a courtroom. There is an action, there is an invisible record, there is a cosmic authority observing the record, and eventually the appropriate reward or punishment is delivered. But this is not the only way karma can be understood. Within the framework developed in this book, karma is better understood as lawful correspondence. Reality does not need to judge an action in order for an action to produce consequences. Fire does not punish the hand that touches it. Gravity does not reward the person who understands physics. A seed does not receive moral approval before it grows. The consequences arise from the structure of the system itself. Karma operates in a similar manner. It is not fundamentally a cosmic courtroom. It is a mechanism of interaction between consciousness and reality. What consciousness carries into experience affects how it encounters experience. What it repeatedly generates becomes part of its structure. That structure influences what it can perceive, what it can understand, what it can tolerate, what it can choose, and therefore what kinds of circumstances it repeatedly enters. The result can look remarkably personal, but personal does not necessarily mean punitive. The universe does not need to say, open quote, you did something wrong, therefore you deserve this. Close quote. The mechanism can be far simpler. Open quote, this is the structure that currently exists, therefore these are the experiences that structure can generate, perceive, attract, sustain, or understand. Close quote, that is karma as mechanics. Karma without a cosmic judge. The most important distinction is between consequence and punishment. Punishment requires judgment. Consequence does not. If a person repeatedly acts from anger, they may construct relationships characterized by conflict. If a person repeatedly acts from fear, their world may progressively organize around avoidance. If a person develops profound attachment to a particular identity, circumstances that threaten that identity may generate disproportionate suffering. None of these outcomes require a supernatural judge. The structure itself is sufficient. This principle becomes even more interesting when applied to consciousness. Consciousness does not encounter reality as an empty observer. It encounters reality through its existing structure. Memory, perception, samskaras, tendencies, attachments, fears, desires, capacities, beliefs, habits, and accumulated impressions all influence the way experience is received. Two beings can therefore encounter the same external event while inhabiting radically different realities. One experiences an insult, another experiences information, one experiences loss, another experiences liberation, one experiences uncertainty as terror, another experiences it as possibility. The external event is not identical to the experience of the event. The karmic structure mediates the encounter. This is why karma cannot be reduced to a simple system of external rewards and punishments. The deeper mechanism concerns correspondence between the structure of consciousness and the field through which that consciousness moves. Consciousness interacting with structured reality. Reality is not an undifferentiated field. It contains structure. There are physical laws, biological laws, social structures, psychological tendencies, temporal sequences, relationships, environments, and countless interacting conditions. Within the traditional Indic understanding, this structured field is not merely physical. Existence contains multiple levels of manifestation, described through concepts such as lokas, lattvas, gunas, samskaras, vasanas, prarabdha karma, and the subtle architecture of embodied existence. The individual does not simply appear inside this structure randomly. The individual participates in it. This participation is what makes karma dynamic. Karma is not simply something that happened in the past. It is the continuing interaction between what has been established and what is being encountered now. A samskara influences perception. Perception influences response. Response creates further impressions. Those impressions influence future perception. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. This is one reason karmic patterns can persist across apparently unrelated circumstances. The surface events change. The underlying structure does not. A person may repeatedly encounter different people, different workplaces, different relationships, different countries, and different situations, yet continue experiencing the same essential pattern. The characters change, the curriculum does not. The recurring pattern reveals the deeper structure. The karmic field. We can therefore imagine incarnation as taking place within a karmic field. This field contains the conditions through which a particular consciousness is capable of learning and expressing itself. The field may include biological constitution, sensory limitations, family circumstances, geographical environment, historical period, cultural conditioning, inherited tendencies, psychological structure, relationships, opportunities, limitations, recurring challenges, talents and capacities, attractions and aversions, encounters with particular people, and circumstances that appear unexpectedly. These conditions do not necessarily constitute a punishment. They constitute parameters. A curriculum requires parameters. A lesson in mathematics requires a certain level of difficulty. A musical student requires an instrument appropriate to their stage of development. A martial artist requires resistance against which skill can develop. Likewise, consciousness requires a field of resistance and possibility through which its latent capacities can become actualized. Without structure, there would be no meaningful development. There would simply be unlimited possibility without differentiation. Karma provides differentiation. Why experiences correspond to present capacity. This leads to one of the central principles of the book. Open quote. Consciousness can only meaningfully process what lies within its present capacity. Close quote. This does not mean that consciousness cannot encounter something beyond its understanding. It can, but encounter and integration are not the same thing. A profound spiritual experience may occur in a person whose consciousness is not yet capable of integrating its implications. A person may receive extraordinary insight and then return immediately to an old pattern. The experience happened. The transformation did not. This distinction is essential. Karmic development is not simply about what happens to us. It is about what our present structure can do with what happens to us. Two people may receive the same teaching. One recognizes it immediately. Another rejects it. Another understands it intellectually but cannot embody it. Another misunderstands it completely. The teaching itself is not necessarily different. The receiving structure is. This is why the same experience can function as completely different lessons for different beings. Reality presents the circumstance. Consciousness determines what can be extracted from it. The capacity principle. The mechanics can therefore be expressed through a simple principle. Open quote. A system cannot consistently produce an output beyond its present structural capacity. Close quote. A consciousness operating through fear will interpret information differently from one operating through clarity. A consciousness dominated by attachment will encounter loss differently from one capable of surrender. A consciousness structured around identity will experience contradiction as threat. A consciousness capable of witnessing identity may experience contradiction as information. The circumstance is only one half of the equation. The other half is the capacity meeting it. This explains an important feature of karmic experience. The same world can contain radically different realities for different beings. A mountain is not the same experience for a mountaineer, a geologist, a farmer, a frightened child, and a person seeking solitude. The mountain has not changed. The relationship to the mountain has. Likewise, reality does not need to change in order for consciousness to enter a different karmic experience. Sometimes consciousness changes first. Then the same circumstances become something else. The accessibility principle. There is a second principle. Open quote. Consciousness cannot reliably express what is not presently accessible to it. Close quote. This has profound implications for karma. People frequently look backward at their lives and ask, open quote, why didn't I know better? Close quote. But the question assumes that the knowledge now possessed was available then in the same form. It was not. The person looking backward is not structurally identical to the person who acted. Experience has changed the system. Understanding has changed the system. Consequences have changed the system. Therefore, the earlier consciousness should not be evaluated as though it possessed the later consciousness's perspective. This does not mean that actions have no consequences. Quite the opposite. Consequences are precisely what participate in development. The experience feeds information back into the system. The system changes. New possibilities become accessible. The karmic process therefore contains an extraordinary feedback loop: experience, perception, response, consequence, learning, structural change, new experience. The curriculum teaches through participation, karma as feedback. This allows karma to be understood as a form of feedback. Feedback does not need to be angry. It does not need to be compassionate. It does not need to approve or condemn. It simply communicates information about the current relationship between a system and its environment. If a particular way of operating repeatedly produces friction, the friction becomes information. If a particular attachment repeatedly produces suffering, the suffering reveals something about the attachment. If a particular perception repeatedly generates conflict, the conflict may expose limitations within the perception. This does not mean that every painful event is directly caused by a previous individual action. That would be an unnecessarily simplistic version of karma. Reality is vastly more interconnected than that. Many conditions intersect within every event. Karma concerns the participation of consciousness within this network of conditions. The question is therefore not always, open quote, what did I do to deserve this? Close quote. A more useful karmic question is, open quote, what does this experience reveal about the structure through which I am encountering reality? Close quote. That question turns punishment into information, and information can be used. The precision of karmic mechanics. One of the most remarkable features of this framework is its apparent precision. Karmic processes do not necessarily operate through dramatic supernatural events. Often they operate through subtle repetition. The same emotional pattern appears. The same type of relationship forms. The same attachment produces the same conflict. The same fear generates the same avoidance. The same desire repeatedly leads consciousness into similar circumstances. Eventually, the pattern becomes visible. This is where karma becomes almost mathematical. Not mathematical in the sense of a simple equation producing a predetermined event, but mathematical in the sense that relationships between conditions produce corresponding outcomes. Change the conditions, and the outcome changes. Change the underlying structure, and the pattern changes. This is why genuine transformation can feel strangely anticlimactic. A person may spend years trying to escape a recurring circumstance. Then the underlying attachment dissolves. Nothing needs to be fought. The circumstance simply loses its karmic grip. The lesson has changed because the learner has changed. Prarabdha and the already moving current traditional Hindu thought offers an especially useful distinction here through the concept of prarabdha karma. Without reducing the entire doctrine to a simplistic formula, prarabdha can be understood as that portion of karmic momentum already brought into manifestation within the present incarnation. This provides an important distinction between what is already unfolding and what is being generated now. An arrow that has already been released cannot simply be wished back into the bow. Likewise, certain conditions may already be in motion. Birth circumstances cannot be retrospectively changed. Certain biological conditions cannot simply be erased through preference. Past actions may have created consequences that must now unfold, but this does not mean consciousness is powerless. The present response remains part of the process. The individual may not control every condition entering the field, but the way consciousness relates to those conditions participates in what happens next. This is where karmic development becomes dynamic rather than fatalistic. The curriculum provides circumstances. Consciousness learns through them. Learning alters capacity. Altered capacity changes future participation. Thus, the karmic stream is neither absolute freedom nor absolute helplessness. It is lawful unfolding with evolving capacity. The administrator does not need to intervene constantly. If karma operates through lawful correspondence, what then is the role of the Archons or karmic administrators introduced earlier? The answer becomes much more subtle. An administrator does not necessarily create every event. An administrator maintains the integrity of a system. A teacher does not personally manufacture every consequence experienced by a student. The teacher establishes the curriculum, provides instruction, evaluates progression, and adjusts the learning environment. Likewise, within this philosophical model, Karmic administration does not require supernatural beings to manually distribute every pleasure and pain. The system itself can perform much of the work through lawful causation. The administrator maintains the architecture. The laws perform the mechanics. Consciousness generates the participation. Experience provides the feedback. Development emerges from the interaction. This is a far more sophisticated conception of cosmic administration than the image of invisible beings sitting above humanity, deciding who deserves suffering. The administrator does not need to hate. The administrator does not need to punish. The administrator simply preserves the integrity of the field. Why the curriculum must sometimes be difficult. A curriculum that never exceeds comfort cannot produce substantial development. This is one of the uncomfortable truths of incarnation. If every difficulty were immediately removed, many capacities would never develop. Courage requires something that can be faced. Patience requires something that cannot be rushed. Detachment requires something to which consciousness is attached. Discernment requires ambiguity. Compassion requires vulnerability. Strength requires resistance. Wisdom requires the discovery that previously held assumptions are insufficient. Therefore, friction is not necessarily evidence that the system has failed. Sometimes, friction is evidence that the system is functioning. This does not mean that suffering should be romanticized, nor does it mean that every tragedy should be explained away as a lesson. The karmic framework does not require indifference. If anything, understanding lawful causation increases responsibility. Where suffering can be reduced, it should be reduced. Where ignorance can be removed, it should be removed. Where injustice can be corrected, it should be corrected. The recognition that reality contains lawful consequences does not make compassion unnecessary. It makes intelligent action more important. The difference between fate and karma. Karma is often confused with fate. They are not identical. Fate suggests a fixed sequence that must occur regardless of consciousness. Karma, as presented here, is more dynamic. The present contains momentum, but consciousness is also evolving. As consciousness changes, its relationship to reality changes. Therefore, the possibilities available to it change. A person may initially encounter a particular circumstance through ignorance. Later, they encounter the same type of circumstance through understanding. The external pattern may remain. The internal relationship has changed. Eventually, the pattern may no longer need to repeat. This is why spiritual development can be understood as the gradual dissolution of karmic necessity, not because someone escapes the laws of reality, because they increasingly understand them. The musician does not escape the laws of music, they master them. The yogi does not escape the laws governing consciousness. They become increasingly conscious of them. Liberation is therefore not lawlessness. It is profound alignment with law. When karma no longer needs to teach the same lesson. A lesson repeats only while it remains necessary. If consciousness continually responds to an experience from the same structure, the experience remains relevant. Once the structure changes, the experience may lose its function. This explains why certain patterns seem to disappear without external intervention. The individual has changed. What once had power no longer has power. What once triggered attachment no longer produces attachment. What once generated fear no longer dominates perception. What once required external validation no longer does. The world may look remarkably similar, but the karmic relationship has changed. This is one of the deepest forms of liberation. The prison door does not necessarily open because someone destroys the prison. It opens because the consciousness that required the boundary has developed beyond it. Karma and the dissolution of the boundary. This returns us to the central premise of the book. If karma is punishment, liberation means escaping punishment. If Archons are jailers, liberation means defeating or escaping the jailers. But if karma is correspondence, liberation means understanding correspondence. If Archons are administrators, liberation means developing beyond the level at which their administration is required. If limitation is curriculum, liberation means completing the lessons that made limitation necessary. The entire spiritual trajectory changes. The enemy disappears, the curriculum remains, and eventually even the curriculum becomes unnecessary. This is closer to the traditional Indic vision of liberation. The goal is not merely to negotiate better circumstances within samsara, it is to understand the mechanism of bondage itself. Attachment creates identification. Identification generates action. Action generates consequence. Consequence reinforces impression. Impression conditions future perception, and conditioned perception generates further action. The wheel continues. Liberation begins when consciousness ceases to operate unconsciously within the wheel. The deeper meaning of karmic administration. Karmic administration, therefore, need not be imagined as an enormous celestial bureaucracy. It can be understood as the ordering intelligence through which consciousness encounters the consequences and conditions appropriate to its present development. Its precision arises from the interconnectedness of the system. Its impersonality arises from lawful operation. Its apparent intelligence arises because the consequences of consciousness are not isolated from consciousness itself. The system does not need to ask, open quote, what punishment should this person receive? Close quote. The system asks a more fundamental question through its own operation. Open quote, given what this consciousness presently is, what can it encounter, perceive, generate, integrate, and become? Close quote. That is a radically different model. It transforms karma from a ledger into a living process, from judgment into correspondence, from punishment into feedback, from fate into developmental momentum, and from cosmic imprisonment into education. The karmic equation. The mechanics developed throughout this chapter can be summarized conceptually. Present structure plus present conditions, present experience. Present experience plus response, consequence. Consequence plus awareness, learning. Learning, structural change. Structural change, new capacity, new possibilities. And therefore, open quote, change the structure of consciousness, and the range of reality that consciousness can inhabit changes with it. Close quote. This is why spiritual development cannot ultimately be reduced to collecting information. Information alone does not necessarily alter structure. The transformation must become embodied in consciousness. A person may know every teaching about detachment and remain deeply attached. They may speak endlessly about surrender while resisting every circumstance they cannot control. They may understand karma intellectually while continuing to interpret every difficulty as punishment. Knowledge becomes liberation only when it changes the mechanism through which experience is processed. That is the difference between knowing the curriculum and graduating from it. The precision of the curriculum. Seen from this perspective, incarnation becomes extraordinarily precise. The family into which one is born, the body one inhabits, the culture surrounding that body, the historical period, the relationships encountered, the limitations experienced, the desires that arise, the fears that persist, the talents that emerge naturally, the recurring obstacles, the opportunities that appear unexpectedly, the circumstances that force consciousness beyond familiar territory. All of these may be understood as components within a larger field of correspondence. This does not require that every event have been individually scripted, nor does it require that every detail be consciously assigned by an external deity. A complex system can produce extraordinary precision through the interaction of lawful principles. The important point is that nothing needs to be arbitrary merely because it is complex. What appears chaotic from within a limited perspective may participate in an order too large to perceive from that position. The student sees one lesson. The curriculum contains the entire course. The shift in perspective. Once karma is understood this way, an entirely different question becomes possible. Instead of, open quote, why is the universe doing this to me? Close quote. We can ask, what relationship between consciousness and reality is being revealed here? Close quote. Instead of, open quote, who is responsible for my suffering? Close quote. We can ask, open quote, what structure within me is participating in the experience? Close quote. Instead of, open quote, how do I escape this? Close quote. We can ask, open quote, what would have to change within consciousness for this experience to cease serving its present function? Close quote. And instead of, open quote, what did I do to deserve this? Close quote. We can ask, open quote, what is this experience teaching me about the way consciousness currently operates? Close quote. These questions do not guarantee easy answers, but they transform the relationship with experience. The individual ceases to stand before existence as an accused prisoner demanding an explanation. They begin to stand before existence as a participant attempting to understand the law. That is the beginning of mastery. Conclusion. The law beneath the lesson. Karma does not need to be a cosmic scoreboard. It can be understood as the lawful architecture through which consciousness meets the consequences of its own structure. Reality does not need to hate us to restrict us. It does not need to reward us to support us. It does not need to punish us to teach us. The laws themselves are sufficient. Consciousness enters a structured field. It encounters conditions corresponding to its present capacity. It responds. Those responses produce consequences. Those consequences generate information. Information can become understanding. Understanding alters consciousness, and altered consciousness encounters reality differently. The cycle continues until the lesson is integrated. Then something extraordinary happens. The same boundary that once seemed oppressive begins to reveal its purpose. The same friction that once seemed hostile becomes intelligible. The same karmic pattern that once seemed like a curse becomes recognizable as instruction. And the administrator who once appeared to be standing between consciousness and freedom is revealed as something else entirely. Not the jailer, not the enemy, but part of the architecture through which consciousness was given the opportunity to become conscious of itself. The purpose of karma in this framework is therefore not to keep consciousness imprisoned. It is to make unconsciousness increasingly impossible. The curriculum does not exist to punish the student. It exists until the student no longer needs it.